a lot of people in those days were really just churning out the words, trying to earn a living because they didn't get paid a lot for stories in magazines. And that really continued through the 30s and 40s, even into the 50s a little bit, that science fiction writers were known like mystery writers or romance writers to just churn out words. They were trying to, I said elevate before, but legitimize their work, that their work was serious, that they were bringing across some very interesting points, that their writing was improving in its own literary quality. And to have it feel like it was cheapened by the term sci-fi, that's what I imagine they would feel. And authors don't seem to be have a problem with arguing.
Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Welcome back if you're a returning viewer. Welcome if you're a new viewer. I'm John and I talk about science fiction. That's the name of the channel actually. Today's topic is a bit of a strange one, depending on what your background is or what your experience with science fiction is. You may find it a bit silly or a bit serious, a bit obvious or completely new and out of the blue, or something in between. And that is because the topic of the video is the history of sci-fi. And by that, I don't mean the history of science fiction, but specifically the term sci-fi, as it is often used to abbreviate science fiction. Well, I'm pretty new to this whole YouTube thing. I've made a few videos now on this channel, all about science fiction in one way or another, and you may have noticed that in none of my videos have I ever used the term sci-fi. I mean, probably not. Why would you notice something like that? It's silly. But in any case, it's true. Not only here on YouTube, but pretty much anywhere where I talk or write about science fiction, I very, very rarely will use the term sci-fi. I always use either the full term science fiction, or when I have to use an abbreviation, especially in writing, it's almost always just the letters SF to denote science fiction. Now, if you've noticed that sort of thing, you certainly have noticed that it's probably not just me. If you read a book about science fiction or an article about science fiction, or maybe you've heard some science fiction authors or certain science fiction fans talk about science fiction, more so in written science fiction than in television or film or other media. But nevertheless, if you sort of go around in those circles, you may have noticed that such people also will almost never or very rarely will use the term sci-fi. For a quick example of this phenomenon, you can take a look at a recently published, pretty popular anthology of science fiction short stories, The Big Book of Science Fiction, edited by Jeff and Anne Vandermeer, an over 1,200-page behemoth of some of the best stories ever written, and it was published pretty recently in it was published in 2016. I thought it was more recent than that, but 2016 is still relatively recently. And it's a really great book. 10 out of 10 would recommend, no notes. So if you're looking for a great anthology on science fiction, definitely check this one out. However, if you Control F the term sci-fi on a digital copy of this book, obtained legally, I'm sure, you'll only get 2 matches, and both of them are in context. They're sort of within the short stories. They're not in the introductions or in the mini essays that are throughout this book. They're always sort of like referring to different scenarios that different characters speak or something, and there's only 2 of them. On the other hand, the term science fiction, that is the full words, appears 653 times on this book, and the term SF, as an abbreviation of science fiction, appears 69 times. I'm going to assume that's deliberate. But anyway, I think my point is made. Of course, that is not a coincidence. Depending how much you read about science fiction, you may have noticed this trend. Many people within the science fiction community, including myself, I suppose, make the deliberate choice not to use that term, because for many people, the term sci-fi is at best an inappropriate way to abbreviate science fiction, and at worst, outright offensive or derogatory towards science fiction. And of course, that's kind of the point of this video, to explain that, as strange as it might sound. But, depending on what your exposure to science fiction is, this may be, duh, obviously, we know this, or, utterly shocking to hear. You live and learn, I suppose. At the same time, I should point out that this is very much a minority of people, even a minority within the science fiction community nowadays, which, however you want to define that, it is massive. Most people, even people that are very frequent and enthusiastic science fiction readers, are completely unaware of this distinction. And even if they are, they usually don't care, or they consider the distinction snobbish, or maybe even a form of gatekeeping, the no true Scotsman fallacy of it all. I've certainly been guilty of that at times. Unfortunately, I've been a snob from a very early age. I guess I can't really help it. However, there was a time around the 50s and the 60s when this debate about what is the correct way to abbreviate science fiction was much more prominent, at least in science fiction circles. At this time, almost the entire science fiction community was united against the idea of using the term sci-fi as the preferred way to describe and abbreviate science fiction, because that was the term that sort of had stuck or was starting to be used as a marketing term to advertise science fiction books and movies, again, around this time, the mid to late 50s and early 60s. The science fiction community didn't like it. They didn't like it. They actually hated it, and they wanted nothing to do with it. Let me actually read some quotes from various books that talk about the history of science fiction, and specifically about the use of the term sci-fi throughout the years. From the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction by Don DaMassa, "Welcome to the world of science fiction, sometimes known familiarly as SF, but rarely sci-fi, which is generally considered to be pejorative by aficionados of the genre and more appropriate for films than literature." From the New Encyclopedia of Science Fiction, edited by James Gunn, "Ackerman invented the term sci-fi, and many people and publications use it, but many fans and authors consider this term used mostly by people in publication who don't understand the genre. They prefer SF or SF." From The Billion-Year Spree by Brian Aldiss, "Only the would-be trendies use sci-fi." From Science Fiction in the 20th Century by Edward James, "Even as science fiction was established, it became common to abbreviate it STF, originating as an abbreviation for scientific fiction, pronounced STEF, or SF, or SF or S-F, pronounced SF, and sci-fi, rhyming with its model hi-fi. STF reached its peak in the early 40s and has since faded away. The other two abbreviations have become something of a shibboleth, with those who use sci-fi being dismissed as neophytes or outsiders by the initiates, who sometimes pronounce it skiffy and use it to mean low-grade mass-market science fiction, like the film Star Wars, for instance, reserving SF or science fiction of, to them, greater value. Sci-fi has become common within film and television circles, however, it is not going to die out." From the Ultimate Encyclopedia of Science Fiction by David Pringle, "SF has inevitably given rise to its own specialist jargon. These are the terms which you have to know to bluff your way into fandom. Rule 1 is, never call it sci-fi." And lastly, from Speculations on Speculation, Theories on Science Fiction by James Gunn and Matthew Candelaria, "Perhaps because of its widespread use in the popular media, in what often seems a denigrating or stereotyping manner, sci-fi has, in effect, become science fiction equivalent of the N-word." Okay, the last one is a bit ridiculous, and I would argue inaccurate for many reasons. However, it shows how strongly many people and scholars from the science fiction community felt about this term. The reasons for this divide are long and complicated, and the point of this video is to at least partially explore or try to explore this topic, at least insofar as it's historically relevant. Now, science fiction is arguably the most popular genre in every medium, but that was not always the case. There was a time, ironically named the Golden Age of science fiction, where this genre was extremely isolated and not taken really seriously by what you would call mainstream literature. I've talked about this before. I think I mentioned it in my city video, etc., but this was known at the time, or this was referred to after that time, I guess, as the science fictional ghetto, because of the isolationist nature of science fiction compared to the rest of literature, and because of what we usually mean when we say ghetto. And there's been a lot that is written about this. I'm not gonna go into all that in this video because it's slightly outside of the scope, but I think it's important to understand how isolated science fiction was from the rest of writing, from the rest of literature, and from the rest of fiction, maybe with the exception of some other areas of pulp fiction, but nevertheless, it was pretty isolated. And this was changing around the 1950s, where the walls of this so-called ghetto began to crumble, and science fiction was starting to get a foothold among mainstream audiences. As this had, both literary and commercial consequences, it was perhaps inevitable that we were going to see some rebranding happen in sort of like in the world of science fiction, and it is precisely under these circumstances that the term sci-fi emerges. Now, instead of pontificating about this topic on my own as usual, I've decided to invite a guest to talk about this, podcast style, to try to explore this topic a little bit further. My guest is Richard Rempel from the Vintage SF YouTube channel. As the channel name suggests, Richard is a huge fan of classic science fiction, and that is what he talks about mostly in his channel, and he's also very knowledgeable about this subject, which made him a great conversation partner for this topic. So I hope you enjoy the discussion as much as I did while talking to Richard. So Richard, thank you for agreeing to talk with me. Would you like to introduce yourself? So whatever you'd like to say for the listeners or the viewers.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me on, Johnny. My name is Richard Rempel, and I have a channel called Vintage SF, science fiction, or you could call it speculative fiction if you want to. And we're going to explore some of that today, I understand. But my channel basically started when I retired. I wanted to start to get back into one of my first loves, science fiction. And I reviewed some of the books that I had started with way back when in my teens, and just started to do collecting of books and reading of books and reviewing books, and met a lot of people on YouTube like yourself. And it's been a great community and a lot of fun, a great retirement project.
Before I get to the rest of the discussion with Richard, a couple of quick things. First, the obligatory begging for subscription section. So, if you got them and if you like the video, why not throw a subscription or two my way? Only if you like the video, of course. Obviously, if you didn't like the video, don't do it. I wouldn't want you to suffer like that. But if you enjoyed this video and if you enjoyed my discussion with Richard, feel free to like it or subscribe to my channel and Richard's channel, of course. So that's all about that. Second, regarding the topic at hand, I know we can be a little bit inflammatory depending on who you talk to and what anyone's background is on the subject, and I don't mean it that way. Yes, I know it's a little bit clickbaity, but fundamentally I'm not interested in starting any drama. I'm certainly not interested in trying to chastise anybody for what term they may or may be using to talk about science fiction. Use whatever you want. I think the history of what sort of like the meaning and connotations of this term have been or are is important, but that's what I'm interested in, sort of like the history of the whole thing. If you're a fan of science fiction, you might find this important as well, but otherwise it's really not that serious. So I hope you take it in the same way that I do, as a lighthearted discussion mostly about history. That's not to say it's not important, but again, it is important mostly in a historical context. With that said, let's get back to my talk with Richard. So the topic, as you kind of hinted at, the topic that I wanted to talk to you about was sort of like the history of the various abbreviations of science fiction, particularly the dreaded or loved, I guess where you stand, sci-fi. And, I wrote this little thing at the beginning down before we get into it. You just want to emphasize that it's going to be a lighthearted conversation. So I know there are people, and maybe myself included, that take this very seriously and have very serious opinions about, what is the correct way to abbreviate science fiction. But at the end of the day, I would maybe argue that it doesn't matter that much. Well, the history of science fiction matters, but maybe in a modern context, it's not that, nothing to get too upset about. So I wanted to keep the whole thing somewhat lighthearted.
And, I think that the genre itself, people had difficulty defining it. They kind of could see and know what it was in terms of the type of fiction it was. And as you had mentioned, some people don't like sci-fi. That's basically in the 50s, sci-fi was seen as almost a derogatory term, that we're looking at more comic book or magazines or B movies with sci-fi. And the writers didn't want to take their craft and bring it down a level or have it thought of that way. So they wanted to have it as a genre with some respect in science fiction, or eventually some people would say speculative fiction. I think, though, over the last 50 to 60 years, sci-fi has changed in terms of the way the general public at least look at it. So some of the old timers, perhaps even like myself or others, had looked at it as a respectability issue of calling it science fiction or SF. But sci-fi right now, I think, is a very respectable term in most people's minds. I don't think they see it as a dig at the genre anymore.
uh, I would argue that is true. So that I would my sort of like research seems to coincide with that. However, I still think that there is some grounds that science fiction has had to make more recently, or has had to sort of like win by force. Like, I don't know if you saw, there was a review from the New York Times of the book Oryx and Crake, the from Margaret Atwood, which is, Margaret Atwood is a person who has sort of like throughout her career has sort of tried to deny the label of science fiction, which is already a factor there, right? But her book Oryx and Crake, which came out early 2000, 2003, 2004, is probably, I haven't read everything of hers, but I read a few, and this is probably the one that is sort of undeniably science fiction. And yet, sort of like if I can just find the review, the reviewer this is 2004, so 20 years ago, but in the grand scheme of things, not that long ago. And the reviewer opens with the line, "I'm going to stick my neck out and just say it. Science fiction will never be literature with a capital L." And this is sort of like the New York Times review of a very well respected writer, because she dared to write something that was very identifiably science fiction, even though she had flirted with the concept before. You could sort of like play that game where is it really? So yes, so what you say is 100% correct, but I think there are still circles within the literary community where science fiction still is viewed with a somewhat of a, I don't know if chagrin is the right term, or somewhere of a something of a second class citizen.
Well, I think that they want to bust out of the genre as well. They want to be seen as a literary piece of work or a popular novel, even. And I think it was Bruce Sterling that came up with the term slipstream to talk about novels that could kind of work as a mainstream novel as well as science fiction. And that they, just like Margaret Atwood did here, denied the genre itself, just said, this is just a novel. This is just something good to read. It's not ghettoized, if we want to go to that term for
Sure.
science fiction.
Sure.
And I know a couple of different people love to use the word slipstream now for some of those type of novels that really are science fiction, but don't label themselves that way.
Yeah. So I would like to talk a little bit more about the history, because it is, I think it helps us understand. And kind of the reason why I wanted to have a discussion is because reading a lot about, I've read almost as much about science fiction history as I've read science fiction itself, because it's very fascinating. But it has the sense of an oral tradition where you get sort of like different accounts from depending on what you read and how you read. And it's not immediately clear to me, sort of like the whole myth around this term. But before we get into that, just a quick question about, do you have, because for example, your channel is not vintage sci-fi, it is vintage SF. What is sort of like do you have a knee-jerk reaction? Do you have even maybe not a conscious, but some conscious things where, okay, if you hear someone say sci-fi versus SF or vice versa, do you have some perhaps biases or even a sort of like a preformed, I don't want to call it prejudice, because I don't think it's that, but there is obviously context that comes with the usage of certain terms versus other terms, etc. I don't know if that made sense.
Well, there was a very conscientious decision here in terms of calling it SF. And that was partially because when I retired, I was watching some YouTube and I came across booktube channels. And I really didn't know that they existed. And I'm going to name drop a channel here. Stephen E. Andrews, the Outlaw Bookseller, is his channel. He argued a number of times in some of the videos I saw about, don't call it sci-fi, call it SF. And it was that reason for looking for respect, not to have it go to a lower denominator than it was, to look at the literature, the good writing that was available in science fiction. So as I was starting to think about my own channel, I was thinking, I mean, I could have called it vintage sci-fi. Perhaps that would have identified more for some of the contemporary viewers as well. But I thought, you know what, SF is a very inclusive term in its own way as well. One problem that I had just a couple times is people thought, I think this channel's about vintage San Francisco, and we're looking for things about, the 1908 quake or something. But SF could be science fiction, speculative fiction, or sci-fi. And so I went for that moniker, and I've stuck with it, and it's worked well for me. Now, I will say,
Sure.
I did start a shorts channel. I separated it from my main channel, and I thought, you know what, let's make this perhaps a little bit more open to the contemporary viewers and people who just think this as sci-fi. And so I called it Sci-Fi Book Shorts. And so about a minute or so, I talk about a book, maybe read from the back of the book and tell the people what the hook is for that book. Some of my friends who maybe don't like the term sci-fi probably don't like that I've called that channel that.
Sure,
but
sure.
That's okay. I'm trying to reach an audience, showing people that there's a lot to offer in science fiction.
Yeah, and just to justify your decision a little bit, I did not include this in our shared document because I just stumbled on it last night. But let me, if I can share my screen really quick. So this is a Google Ngram viewer, which my understanding is it looks up words from all the books that are in Google Books from, I think, the 1800s, although I've set a limit to the 1940s here. And we see, so if we search the terms sci-fi novel, SF novel, and science fiction novel, of course, you cannot just search SF because, like you said, SF could mean so many things, and that will kind of pollute the data. So we have like this top line is science fiction novel. And again, this is attaching the word novel to it. And we see that this one always is sort of like more, has more mentions. And we see that SF novel has more mentions up until the 90s. And there's this peak in the 90s for whatever reason. But after sort of the mid 90s, then the term sci-fi novel comes, becomes the more well-known. However, like I mentioned, this includes the word novel in it. So if we compare these three terms with just the term sci-fi, so if I just add sci-fi here, we see that sci-fi completely trumps everything else.
And I sometimes wonder, and we can see it started in the 70s.
Yes.
But some of the things that I see, I wonder when we had the channel, the sci-fi channel, or some people call it Sci-fi now.
When did that start? I know they changed the name to Sci-fi around the 2000s, but when did that start?
It still is sci-fi, but I think that started somewhere in the early 90s. It's a cable network, perhaps even the 80s, but yeah. I don't know. I don't know for sure. But my guess is that started to popularize the term in a way that wasn't derogatory.
That may be the case. So let's explore this a little bit. So why it was that it was considered derogatory. So I wrote down, and I believe this is common knowledge, but it's sort of like I read a bunch of books for this. I'm a little proud of myself. Good
job.
I did. So everybody agrees that it was introduced by Forrest Ackerman around 1954. And I found sort of like a newspaper article where he said he was driving by on his car, and on the radio the term hi-fi came up. And he thought, oh, that sounds cool. Then he talked to his wife, and his wife said, oh, this will never catch on. And obviously she was wrong. It did catch on. And it sort of like was immediately rejected by the sort of like the insular science fiction community. And of course, it's important to set this in the larger context where this was just around the time of the walls of the ghetto breaking. This was the time where, science fiction was breaking out of the pulp magazines, where there's some debate on whether the golden ages also should be considered pulps, but let's say the pulp magazines. And not only into books, hardcovers, softcovers, novels, etc. A lot of fix-ups were starting to pop up, but also into cinema. Hollywood was also starting to pay attention. So it kind of makes sense to me that Ackerman, who was a fan, but also somewhat of an agent, a lesser known fact, that he was somewhat of an agent, and probably was guiding these young writers. Especially, he was taking on a lot of sort of inexperienced writers that were trying to get help to break into the industry. He was taking them. So it kind of makes sense that he was thinking about ways to sort of like advance this new genre, that up until that point existed in a ghetto. And perhaps, would you like to say a couple of things about what was the science fiction ghetto, or at least what the perception is as you've known it throughout your life of what the science fiction ghetto was.
Well, we're tossing around this term, and I'm not sure if I would exactly agree with ghetto, except that that's a way that people can just wrap their heads around it.
Can we call it isolationism?
Sure. Yeah. It was a situation where we had scientific romance was the term that was being used primarily close to the turn of from the 1800s into the 1900s. And we had magazines really start to grab onto science fiction in the 1920s with Hugo Gernsback, who the Hugo Awards is named after. He was an editor, and he was actually an editor of, I believe it was mechanical magazines, etc., before he started grabbing these stories. And he came up with the term scientifiction. Doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. Eventually it became science fiction, and they were really, a lot of people in those days were really just churning out the words, trying to earn a living because they didn't get paid a lot for stories in magazines. And that really continued through the 30s and 40s, even into the 50s a little bit, that science fiction writers were known like mystery writers or romance writers to just churn out words. And so that's where I think we get this ghetto idea, is because you're trying to earn a living. So not every piece can be a really great novel that you've strove to do your best work in. You're just trying to get a paycheck each month. So maybe you're throwing out 3 or 4 short stories in that time period. And I think that that's where you were talking about in the 1950s. That's where they were starting to get contracts for actual novels. And with those contracts and with the agents that came along in that time period as well, this is where they're trying to elevate what they were doing. And that's where it particularly hit a nerve, I believe, especially with science fiction is known for science fiction conventions. And this was an opportunity where lots of authors, filmmakers even, but primarily authors and fans got together. And so that's where this argument would happen about what we should call it and what we're doing here, and trying to bring this a little bit higher in the level of literature in regards to the public, in regards to the critics even. And I think you see a lot of experimentation start with the late 50s into the 60s as well, as they try to find their way.
Yeah, I think you did a great job at sort of like delineating the self-imposed aspect of this isolationism that exists in science fiction, because like you said, when you're trying to make a living churning out 3, 4, 5, 6 stories in however time, obviously the quality is going to drop. I would argue there was also, in a sense, where the rest of literature did not see science fiction as sort of a serious. The mainstream literary community did not see science fiction as serious, primarily by the fact that all these other genres that you mentioned, mystery, crime, fantasy, yes, they thrived in the pulps and they existed as arguably low quality literature, but you still had respectable mystery writers. You still had respectable fantasy writer. Tolkien was sort of like an academic darling, right? But that did not happen with science fiction. Science fiction seems to be the only genre where, at least in the US, perhaps this doesn't apply outside of the US, but at least in the US around this time, even the writers who had literary ambitions, I'm thinking Bradbury, that's the only one I can think of, but I'm sure there were others. I think CMAC was also maybe belonged in that category, where they had more like literary ambitions, but they would have to wait until the late 50s, until the new wave came along to sort of like realize those ambitions and maybe be taken more seriously, not just by this very insular, very protected, very guarded science fictional community, but also what you would call mainstream literature.
I would push back on that a little bit.
Sure.
I think Olaf Stapledon was putting out some very quality work out at that time. I was thinking of not George Orwell, let's see.
Brave New World.
Yeah, that's Orwell though, right?
No, that's Aldous Huxley.
That's who I was trying to think of. Aldous Huxley.
But that's UK.
Olaf Stapledon. Yeah, you're right about that. I'll have to think about this, but I think that there are people who are outside, you know what, and they're not necessarily part of the magazines. They're part of the actual novel culture and selling their novels. And I think that those people didn't necessarily get weighed down by the magazines at that point because I don't think they were equated at the same way.
Yeah, and I should say that part of this is based on sort of what I read, but there's also a part that is kind of speculative because, like I said, I haven't been able to find sort of like a definitive source or something that says, okay, here's what was happening, this is why, or this is why. And in your estimation, why did the science fictional community have such a initial aversion, I guess, to the term sci-fi? Because one thing that I kind of found was that in 1954, Ackerman proposed that term sci-fi, but it wasn't used. You didn't see it in magazines. You saw it. You didn't. In an astounding fantasy and science fiction galaxy, the term sci-fi was not used. The only place that I found was in 1955 and 1956 was a column that Ackerman wrote. There was a short-lived column that Ackerman wrote in If magazine, If Worlds of Imagination or something, which was a sort of like the third most famous at the time after Astounding and what was the other one? Galaxy. So it existed in the same and was respectable for a while, but it didn't survive past the 50s. But he had a semi-regular column, and in that column he was using the term sci-fi sort of casually. So you could tell he was very proud of it. He was trying to get it to catch on. But I could not find any evidence around this time that it was being adopted by the science fiction community. And again, purely speculation. I could be wrong. I have a feeling that Ackerman just wanted science fiction to be sci-fi. That was sort of like a catchy term, because he thought hi-fi was sort of like a catchy term. But anyway, after all that monologue, what did you think about sort of the initial response of the science fiction community? What do you think was the motivation there?
I'm speculating as well, but my speculation would be there's times where nicknames are thrust onto people that they really don't like. And I'm sure many of us have had that happen, perhaps even to ourselves. And the community, which was getting book contracts and agents, they were trying to, I said elevate before, but legitimize their work, that their work was serious, that they were bringing across some very interesting points, that their writing was improving in its own literary quality. And to have it feel like it was cheapened by the term sci-fi, that's what I imagine they would feel. And authors don't seem to have a problem with arguing going after each other and debating these points. And Ackerman, yeah, I would agree. He said, "Hey, this is a cool term. I invented it. I'm going to push it." Just like Hugo Gernsback had science fiction and then science fiction. But I think that it's really a visceral response to not liking a term that would cheapen what you are trying to elevate.
Yeah, and I would probably agree with that. I think that's more or less sort of what I think. When sort of like I'm obviously a much newer fan of science fiction than you are, but sort of like the moment there was, so to kind of put my biases forth, there's this kind of immediate sense of when you're like, from my perspective, from a modern reader's perspective, when you hear that there is this separation of the true science fiction fans and the phonies that use sci-fi, you immediately want to belong and say, okay, so I've sort of like, I should say that I've committed to the SF camp. But I think at the time, I can also see maybe this knee-jerk reaction. And again, grain of salt, speculation, all that. But I can see this knee-jerk reaction where we endured the ghetto, to use that term again. You don't get to come and tell us what we're supposed to call our work, right? Because it was, again, at this time, it was not adopted by the science. You did not see it in science fiction publications, except for the few occasions that Ackerman would go in and say, hey, let's use this term. Of course, I think towards the 60s, then you started seeing a little bit more, especially in the fan sections where the fans would send the letters and the magazines would publish them. There I found, because I did the whole thing. I downloaded a bunch of PDFs. I wrote some code to like search all the tests on PDF. So I had to be sure, but that's when I started seeing it a little bit more like, or some advertisement would say, come to this bookstore, all the new sci-fi is there. That's when you started seeing, but that didn't start happening until the late 50s and 60s. But I think the non-science fictional community at the time probably started adopting the term a little more enthusiastically, maybe just like hi-fi, because hi-fi was never sort of like a rigorous technical term. It was more of an advertising term, and maybe sci-fi was sort of like the same thing. And the science fiction people are like, hey, we had to endure this isolation for all these like 2-3 decades. You don't have to come in and just tell us what to call ourselves. We will get to decide. I don't know if you think there was a little bit of that in that sense.
Well, I think you've hit on exactly what it was used for, as advertising, whether it was comic books or movies or paperbacks sitting in a spinner rack in the drugstore. It was a great way to just capsulate, okay, that's what we have here. We have sci-fi here. And it was a nice nickname or short term to it, a catchy term to it. And so I think that marketing aspect of it is really where Ackerman was pushing it to. Ackerman, by the way, he was with all these science fiction writers for a long time. So he really grew up with them from his teenage years and onwards in fan clubs and things as well. So I wouldn't separate him from them. He's kind of one of them in terms of being part of that community.
That's also
but that still means that there's a disagreement there. And I'll give you an example. Ray Bradbury, a lot of people consider his work, his short stories, to be of a literary quality, but he was so excited to see some of his work adapted into comics. He was a big comic book fan from being a kid. And so there wasn't necessarily a separation. There's degrees of respect and love for different genres, different medium, including the movies as well, or even TV shows. Some of them, they're of their time, and sometimes some of those are pretty cringy, but a lot of us love some of those old monster movies or alien movies. And it coexisted together in that realm of science fiction, but more likely promotionally they were called sci-fi.
A little bit of a digression, but I do think that there is an interesting contrast there between Bradbury, who was, as you said, his work had a sort of a literary higher quality, not higher, but literary quality, and Vonnegut, how do you pronounce Vonnegut. Okay.
Kurt Vonnegut from the 60s.
Who, I mean, perhaps this is not true. Maybe this is sort of like a misunderstanding, but my understanding is that he somewhat avoided that he was not as enthusiastic about being part of sort of like whether it was comic book adaptations or even just being part of the sort of like the science fiction label, even though I think you can unambiguously say a lot of his work is sort of very clearly science fiction, maybe speculative fiction if you're a little bit more charitable for some of them, but it seems hard to avoid that categorization.
Yeah, he's kind of one of those early examples of slipstream, trying to be mainstream, but definitely science fiction.
Yeah. But again, I think that is somewhat, and some of the authors that I read in preparation for this seem to make that point, that it was kind of what you had to do at the time. At least some people felt that they had to do that, because maybe it was genuine, maybe it was a misunderstanding, maybe it was just the perception of the time. But if you wanted to be a serious author who is in contention for all these serious quote unquote writer awards, you could not put yourself in the same camp as Asimov or Heinlein or Simak or all these someone who published in those types of magazines.
Well, you also want to broaden your audience for potential sales.
Of course.
So if you felt that you were narrow in sci-fi, well, there's an audience for it. You could definitely sell to that audience. But if you're just a good book, then there's a wider audience potential depending how your publisher deals with it.
Yeah, and that's absolutely true. So the one thing about, to use that word again, the ghetto, was that it was not just a ghetto for the authors, but it was also somewhat for the readers, because many at the time, at least if I remember correctly from one of James Gunn's book, he makes this point where a lot of people who read science fiction, they were not readers. They only read science fiction. So there was this sort of like isolationism from both aspects of the author-reader partnership. And I suspect perhaps that's why at the end the authors sort of acquiesced a little bit. They said, you know what, whatever they call us, in the end, if this opens up to a much wider audience to sell our books, they sort of like were willing to give up that the naming rights, I guess.
And I think you had to also get out of that echo chamber too. You didn't want everything to be, spaceships and laser guns and damsels in distress. You needed to widen that out so that you start to get more creative stories, and science fiction really revels in its ideas. And so to widen out those ideas, you had to get out of that echo chamber as well, go into more biology, go into philosophy, go into all different areas of life to broaden that area.
So you did mention a little bit earlier that you named your channel because you heard of like Outlaw. What's the name of the person?
His channel's called the Outlaw Bookseller.
So, I'm familiar with the channel, but I don't
UK.
remember the name.
Yeah, he's from the UK, and he works in bookstores and selling books, and has an experience with science fiction authors and other people from the UK for the last 40 years or so. So he's a very knowledgeable man.
In a lot of the books, some of which I posted on the shared Google Doc, there is this sentiment all throughout. If you look at the quotes, never call it sci-fi, and these are some of them are in the 2000s, so it's certainly not an old timer thing. I think even in the one I make, so the speculation of speculations, theories on science fiction, which I think this is from the 80s or 90s, they even go as far as to compare the term sci-fi with the N-word, which I would say that's a little bit extreme. But it goes to show that a lot of people, especially maybe more of the academic type, still feel very strongly of it. And you can argue that, okay, James Gunn is an old-timer. I think didn't he pass away recently? A few years ago, yeah. But even, more modern, still, I would argue maybe relatively academic book on the history of science fiction or on critical interpretations of science fiction, etc. They strictly use the SF moniker, or if they use sci-fi, it's always because they're trying to address some aspect of popular culture. So I guess the question that I have is, do you think this is, is it just a remnant, sort of like strong-headedness? Do you think there's some gatekeeping aspect to this sort of debate? Or do you think it's just, okay, academics, maybe it's more appropriate for an academic setting to use SF, and let's let the marketing people use sci-fi?
I think the latter. I think that, the SF Encyclopedia, science fiction encyclopedia, or books that are studying science fiction will use SF as their short form for it. I think that the sci-fi is sort of an abbreviation with that is two words pushed together, whereas SF is actual abbreviations of the word science fiction. And so it becomes a sloppy term in terms of academics, I believe. And so that's why I think that to this day, people don't use that in an academic look at science fiction. I think rightly so. I think that there's definitely a good argument in that area. I think when you're talking to the broader public in the marketing term, that sci-fi is that accepted nickname. And everybody who talks about sci-fi knows that they're referring to science fiction. It's become, for many, more of a warm, comfortable phrase for it, not something that is used in any form to be derogatory. And I would argue that the vast public of the last decade, that would be the case. But some people, critics, others who are in that academic field, would use that term as a term that's derogatory to the field. And that's where academics needs to hold that higher standard of the phrase science fiction, speculative fiction, SF as the shorts for those.
Yeah, I think Asimov was the one that proposed that, say, let's keep the term sci-fi for the garbage stuff and we'll keep SF for the serious one. But I would argue that if you're making that distinction, it's almost already a losing battle, because you're sort of like, you're creating, because in every genre there are good books and there are bad books. In every art form there are bad forms of arts and good form of arts, and sort of separating as this is this art. I don't know if I can articulate this, but if Picasso's good paintings were paintings and like we called his lesser paintings doodles, that doesn't make sense, right? It's art, and some of it is better than other, and that's so I would argue that's a losing battle. But, and this is what again, maybe perhaps putting on the table some of my personal biases, I can't help but have this sort of, like I said, knee-jerk reaction. Whenever I hear someone say SF, I say, okay, this guy is solid. And when I hear people say sci-fi, they're not with us. They're outsiders. And of course, I said at the beginning of the interview, this is meant to be lighthearted. It's all in good fun. Yeah. But perhaps it is that sort of like that us versus them mentality, the not true Scotsman fallacies, and all those that perhaps have been ingrained. That's maybe perhaps why I wanted to do this video and have this discussion, to maybe kind of like address those biases, or are they justified? Are they not? Why do they exist?
I think I'm a very generous person when it comes to people with opposing views or different views. And so I find it very difficult to take the terms science fiction, SF, or sci-fi and polarize within a smaller community. I mean, we get together to celebrate the things that we read or see, and to speculate on more things that are out there. Some of us, and yourself definitely included, love the science portion of this as well, and love the forecasting potential, or the how do we deal with technology and change? What does it do in our humanity? So much to explore. But what I'm trying to say is, I don't think it's a place to plant your flag on the hill and die for it, because I think we're together in this. And sure, there's varying degrees of things that people enjoy. I'll give you an example. When I was a kid, I saw a TV show from the UK called Space 1999.
Yeah.
By no means any sort of classic science fiction elements really to it. Some not bad special effects for the time. Very schlocky stories.
Well, that was from the 70s, right?
It was from the 70s.
Yeah. And
so I look upon it warmly, and it's embraced along with some of, Samuel R. Delaney, or, I can embrace the whole spectrum, or comic books, or B movies from the 50s. I can embrace all those in here, but I don't think it helps us to polarize. I think we can call people to look at literature that stretches us, that reaches high, and celebrate that. And there's lots of it from the earlier stages of science fiction that we can also bring forward. That's part of what I do here on Vintage SF. But there's certainly stuff being written today too that in the future is going to be looked at as a classic of the genre too. And so we may not see it right now. Sometimes you do, but it's not a place, I think, that I'll use the word polarizing. And I think polarizing is not the right way to do this. I don't mind arguments and debates. I think that that's a lot of fun, but let's embrace it all and try to reach for the higher elements if we can.
In my notes, I have, so I had reasons to use the term and reasons not to use the terms. And the reasons to use it is because the debate is over. So this is in many ways academic. Like, the debate is over. Like you said more than once, when you say sci-fi, is people understand what you do. In fact, they probably understand much better than if you say SF. Today. So
definitely
any debate that to be had, and I guess that was the original intention, is about sort of like the historical significance of the term and why the debate even exists. I do think that it is not problematic and not troubling, but I do think that it or at least what fascinated me to the topic initially was how something that pretty much, or at least almost uniformly, the science fiction community did not like, yet it ended up happening anyway. That's sort of like a incredibly I'll keep using the word fascinated, because it is fascinating. It's historically interesting to sort of like an entire group not to have control, or not to be able to sort of like dictate what it is. And maybe it is something that I think you mentioned this, or you implied it, that didn't matter at the end because it's not that it dictated anything else other than just an abbreviation that would appear on some poster board outside a shop. So, but
I think
it's still nevertheless fascinating.
I think that people love nicknames. You know, high fidelity, hi-fi, a lot easier to say, and you still, vast majority of people know that hi-fi meant high fidelity, at least at the time. There's could be a lot of viewers today that don't necessarily know what a hi-fi is, or what we're referring to there in music. You know, lots of actors have nicknames, uh, it's something that's often used as a term of endearment. And so that's where I think sci-fi is now. It's more of a term of endearment, but the academics and some of the people who remember the years and of disagreement on this, uh, it's hard to leave that behind.
Yeah, I do think I actually you mentioned this. Hi-fi is not really used anymore. The sound engineers seem to have abandoned it. In fact, it seems to almost imply somewhat of a snake oil because it's not because of its lack of precise technical definition. Anybody can sort of like plaster it on a box and say this is hi-fi and to sort of to increase the perceived quality of a product, even though it doesn't necessarily meet the standards that someone who perhaps was familiar with how the term was used in the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
You know what? I remember something just recently I heard about a person quizzing somebody who was born in this millennium and asking them, do you know what the yellow pages are? And they had not a clue what yellow pages are. For those viewers who are watching who may not know, let me just clue you in that we used to have phone books that were delivered to us yearly that had white pages, which were the names of people and their streets and their phone numbers. And then the yellow pages were businesses and organizations that you could look those up in. But that's not something we've printed for probably the last, 15, 20 years now?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Same thing. Yeah. One thing that I kind of have, and we're approaching the end. I don't want to take too much of your time, but one thing that I wrote is that perhaps, like I said, the debate happened a long time ago. It doesn't matter anymore. It's settled. It's only.
I wouldn't go so far as doesn't matter. It's still interesting in its historical area, and I think it's still interesting to the academics in particular.
Yeah, and it can sort of like explain sort of maybe the trajectory of science fiction and all that. But one area where it may still sort of directly affect is that, and this is, again, I'm taking this from one of my sources. I'm sure they will be in the description when I finish the video and all that. But SF can mean more than just science fiction. It can mean speculative fiction. It can mean science fantasy, speculative fantasy. One term that kind of blew my mind was structural fabulation, which is a term by Robert Scholes, who's sort of like a literary theorist and a scholar, and he wrote about science fiction, which is, as I understood it, and I didn't read a lot about it, but as I understood it, meant to be this general sort of like unrealism or non-realism or something like that. And sort of the term sci-fi doesn't capture those. It's perhaps a minor point, but it is nevertheless an important point. And you could argue, well, what if we just use sci-fi for strictly science fiction and SF for all the other stuff? That's a valid argument. One potential problem is that now, especially as writers like to experiment with genre more and more, and sort of you find, and perhaps this already started in the 60s, but it's kind of evolved throughout. It's harder to pinpoint something as strictly science fiction, or maybe something that is more speculative fiction, something that perhaps has elements that in the past you would qualify as fantasy, but now they're something in a work that is 80% of it is recognizable as science fiction, but there's a 20% that's like, oh, this is fantasy. Where did this come from? And then the slipstreams fiction, which you mentioned a few times, another SF, that's also yet another category. And it's as we experimenting with genre more, and as genre becomes perhaps less defined, there'll always be works that are 100% identical to science fiction, but there are also a lot that aren't. And for those, perhaps you can make, I think, maybe a somewhat objective argument that the term sci-fi is inadequate to describe those works.
And I think what's really fun with this genre is we've never been able to quite encapsulate it with all of these different definitions, all these different phrases. we haven't quite been able to encapsulate it. Most of us say, I know it when I see it, but can't necessarily pinpoint things. And you were talking about, Atwood earlier, Atwood, Crichton. There's a lot of authors, even Clancy, that dealt with things that potentially were science fiction at the time, even if it was just near science fiction, just, a couple of years ahead. There's a lot of people wrote cyberpunk type things in the 80s and 90s, which now look, a lot of the terminology is part of our culture and part of our beings and the phones that we have with us and etc. I would just say that I think one of the exciting things is to just continue to have a discussion about what are the things that attract us to this genre? How does this genre spread? I think it encompasses all other genres as well. Like you can have a mystery science fiction, you can have romance science fiction, you can have whatever you could have out there. Science fiction can be part of that, or sometimes people would call it a mashup. But I think that it's integral to everything. And whether we know it or not, many of us enjoy science fiction, even if we don't think we read science fiction.
Yeah, and many people point out, probably since the 80s, science fiction is one of the best-selling genres, at least in book form. So
yeah,
perhaps I can complain about it all day, but whoever the marketing people knew something, or at least did something right, at least as far as the commercial aspect of the genre.
Well, and it exploded. I mean, with Star Wars and some other fantasy elements, it exploded in its own way into popular culture as well. And I would think that in the 80s, they still had a little bit of a pushback to those elements that they would call sci-fi. But ultimately, we seem to have all come around to one big circle, well, most of us, of embracing some of these things.
Yeah, and actually, again, another minor digression. Part of the reason why in my channel I also cover movies is because I do think movies are an integral part in the evolution of science fiction, especially post World War II. The period of cinema from the 50s all the way to the 70s, perhaps ending with 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is considered one of the greatest movies. In many lists, it's either the first, the second, or the third greatest movie of all time. I think the BFI list, the AFI list, and all that happens to be not only a science fiction movie, but a science fiction very much in sort of like the golden age tradition of science fiction. And sort of like definitely cinema definitely had something to do with sort of like that explosion.
Well, we could talk for a number of episodes about 2001. There's a lot of amazing things there with Clarke and Kubrick together. Two great minds in two different fields. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Movies are fascinating. That's a great topic that you cover, that span of time.
Clarke doesn't get enough credit. I mean, he does, but at least in cinema circles, Kubrick gets all the credit for that movie, and I don't think Clarke gets as much credit. If you read, I'm sure I have, if you read other Clarke novels, and if you watch other Kubrick movies, or Kubrick, however you say it, 2001, the movie, is much closer to Clarke than it is to other Kubrick movies. There are recognizable elements of Kubrick in there, but it reminds me much more of 2010. I think that was the sequel, or Rendezvous for Rama. That could be another 2001, essentially. Like it's essentially the same. Well, it has the same overall signatures that it's very recognizable in Clarke.
Well, there's a great book out there. I'm just looking to see if I have it right available, but it's 2001: A Space Odyssey. The novel is out there, but there's something called The Worlds of 2001, which details that relationship of Clarke and Kubrick through the diary or journal that Clarke had at that time, and also all the different rewrites that Clarke did, including the rewrites. So you can see different alternate portions of 2001 and an alternate ending to 2001. If you are a fan of that movie, The Worlds of 2001 by Arthur C. Clarke, find it. it's really fascinating.
Yeah, I remember the video that you did about it. You did a video maybe a few months ago about that. So I definitely
Yeah,
remember.
you can find that on my channel if you just search for 2001.
Yeah, yeah. Another thing that I just want to touch on, and perhaps we finished our main discussion, so this is just a little fun side discussions, but you mentioned about science fiction being very prone to mashups. And I'm sure this has been written about. Certainly, I'm not the first one to say it, but in many ways, science fiction is more of a setting or of category of setting than it is a genre. I don't think that's 100% accurate because there are tropes of storytelling that exist in science fiction, which is what sort of tends to define a genre. But it is, I think, perhaps more predominantly a setting. It is a type of setting. It's a science fictional setting, which you can have an adventure story, a romance story, a Western. A Western is also perhaps a setting, but the types of stories that you tell in a Western, a war type of story, etc. So there is certainly that aspect of science fiction which perhaps separates it from, you know, a romance, because a romance is very much a genre defined by the plot, what happens, or the characters, what the characters do, and all that, where science fiction is not quite that, even though you do have recognizable tropes in science fiction.
And there's lots of subgenres, like when you say military sci-fi, military science fiction, that's definitely a subgenre that many people love. Or there could be, some people call it cozy science fiction, and that could be more of something where there is just a gentle version of some sort of catastrophe or a gentle version of some sort of development. Typically, people think of it as something perhaps from the 50s, from John Wyndham, for example.
Okay.
Although I would argue that his stuff can be quite, if you really look at it, it can be quite shocking too in some of the developments in his fiction. I'm not sure why I brought that one up, but there's definitely your Western science fiction that has become more and more popular. If you talk about TV shows, Firefly loved that, and a lot of people called Star Trek when it first came out as Wagon Train to the Stars.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a fun. I can see the setting portion of it, but yes, it does have its lore and tropes as well.
There are stories, you know, stories in sense of like events and characters that can only exist in a science fictional setting, which maybe you cannot say for other type. For example, a story that takes place in Canada can also take place in the US. Perhaps it gets a little bit more complicated, because if you want a story about the Trojan War, that can only take place in Troy in whatever BC it was. So the definitely settings have their unique characteristics, which can only be the one place. But again, if you change the name of the Trojan War, you can have a similar war pretty much anywhere. But you can only have cyberpunk or neuromancer in that world that Gibson creates. William Gibson. I forgot his first name for a second.
That was one of the last great kind of breakthroughs in what we'll call subgenre in SF in my mind, was cyberpunk. And it kind of almost lasted maybe a decade, and now it's kind of just part of all sorts of literature again too. It's kind of broken out. But there was a concentrated period in that mid 80s where it was exciting and different and raw. And I think we're still all waiting for something like that to happen again in science fiction, where we find another sort of leap forward with a couple of key authors in a way that is very exciting. Yeah. I hope I see that happen.
Yeah, I'm not as well appraised of modern science fiction. I think I recently read the trilogy for the first time, sort of like the Sprawl trilogy, I think it's called. The Neuromancer, Count Zero, and Mona Lisa Overdrive.
Yes.
I caught the cyberpunk bug a little bit, so I sought other works, and they quite didn't do it for me. And I think one of the reasons why is because one thing that Gibson doesn't get enough credit for, or maybe he does, and I just haven't seen it. But in addition to the world, the science fictional merits of the story, he's a very good writer. as in so in terms of
I
just
agree.
pure literary quality. It's sort of like his turn of phrase, his prose, his everything about it is just so well structured. I feel like I am reading someone who, in a different circumstances, could be a Pulitzer Prize or a Nobel Prize winning writer. That's how good. At least I haven't read anything else by Gibson, just that trilogy and maybe one of the short stories. And that's that Neil Stephenson is someone who is sort of like recommended immediately, which I haven't read anything from. But I don't know if he has the same quite literary quality, because it's certainly hard to replicate.
Do you want my opinion?
Yeah, certainly.
I'm in the middle of a Stevenson again, and it's my fourth Stevenson I'm reading. I think that Gibson is ahead of him
Okay.
by quite a bit in that area. Stevenson does have some very interesting ideas, and to me, his mixing history, philosophy, and science fiction, that's Neil Stephenson's area and where he thrives.
Yeah. And to take it back to sort of like the science fiction and the origin of science fiction, and I don't know if science fiction is the only genre that does this, but it's certainly the most prominent ones, where you can get away with acceptable writing if your ideas, the ideas that you explore, are worthwhile. The term of what acceptable writing is may be a bit ambiguous. I think that it's harder to do now than perhaps it was back during the Golden Age or even before the Golden Age, but readers of science fiction will forgive having not the best writing in terms of prose quality or even in terms of just storytelling ability, if the ideas that you explore are innovative, are thought-provoking, are like you said, something that makes you chew on the concept, on the larger concept of the story.
Every science fiction fan wants that sense of awe and wonder, that the neurons lighting up in their mind with something that's a fascinating concept or idea, or a paradigm shift all of a sudden within there where you see things in a new, different way. It's a craving. It's almost an addiction for science fiction fans, and that's where many different writing levels can hit that pleasure area for science fiction here.
Yeah,
For science fiction fans.
Yeah, and to circle back, I think perhaps maybe that's what the sci-fi moniker is sort of been able to do, is sort of broaden the concept and bring in talent that perhaps would not be familiar with SF, but they are familiar with sci-fi writers who maybe have read only Dostoevsky and Hemingway, and that inspired them to include maybe some science fiction in their writing, in this hypothetical scenario that I just made up on the spot. But I will never use the term. I will stick to my SF because I think I'm too deep into now. But I certainly, and like we mentioned many times, I don't think it is a battle worth having in today's world. I think it's fine. It doesn't matter. But it is important to know that at least at one point, people did not like it, and why did they not like it? What was the historical context? And then sort of like understand that, while also acknowledging that perhaps doesn't exist anymore. That it is that we are living the historical context of today is different than the historical context of the 50s and 60s, where this debate was being had.
Well, and I think that when we've gone to school, we've been challenged with novels that are a little bit further and further advanced, or we've been challenged in how we study or see something, or to look for the subcontext perhaps of a piece of literature. And I think there's just the enjoyment level, and then there's the challenge ourselves to see more in something. And I think that that's where SF is going to sustain that terminology versus sci-fi.
I don't have anything else. I've gone through all my notes, but is there anything that you would like to close with? Perhaps a last words of some kind? That sounded ominous, but you know what I mean. The final thoughts. Maybe that's more appropriate.
Well, I'm just glad that you're looking into this, and that you invited me to talk with you on this. And so you've brought me to your channels, both channels. Johnny Loves Science Fiction. Is that what it's called?
Talk Science Fiction, which I'm
science
terrible.
Fiction, and then Johnny Talks Science as well, right?
Yeah. I'm terrible with names. So I did not know what else to call them. So that's what.
Well, the nice thing is, because it works together so well, it's just the change of one additional word.
Yeah.
That works well.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that. And you know what? BookTube, YouTube, there's lots of things to explore then, where once you start to talk to different people, you start to get linked to other people, and if this is an area that you enjoy, there's lots to explore here too.
Sure. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed my discussion with Richard, and you have not checked out his channel yet, please do. There are some really great videos in there. I've been watching it for a while and I've gotten several great book recommendations from his channel, including the one about 2001, the movie and the book that he mentioned in the interview. One thing that stuck with me after recording the interview, which was a couple of days ago as I'm recording this right now, was his comparison of the term sci-fi with that of a nickname of maybe a person or a community, or anywhere that a nickname is appropriate to use. Nicknames come in from a variety of sources and can represent a variety of ideas, and they're almost always external. We don't really have much control of it. We don't choose it. It's sort of like given to us. Sometimes nicknames are enthusiastically received, and sometimes they're only begrudgingly tolerated. So in a sense, I think that's a very good analogy. It does raise the question, to what extent can someone push back against an undesired nickname? Not exactly the same thing, but the whole thing reminds me a little bit of how Tolkien, in many of his writings, pushed back against the idea of his work, especially The Lord of the Rings, being interpreted as an allegory. It was a very common belief at the time, almost immediately after he released it, which was right after World War II, if I remember the dates correctly. And sort of like it's obviously that it would be interpreted that it's obvious that it would be interpreted that way. But he pushed back against that idea quite aggressively. He actually hated the idea. He hated allegories in general, and he didn't want people to interpret his work that way. And surely his push back against it didn't stop those interpretations. Many people still interpret The Lord of the Rings today as an allegory in whole or in part, and perhaps I'm in one of those as well, regardless of Tolkien's many objections of the idea. Nevertheless, I would argue that his pushback against it, it did help shift the conversation away from that and towards other direction, at least in part. Like today, if you argue that The Lord of the Rings is an allegory, or part of it is an allegory in some forum online, on Reddit or somewhere, there will always be plenty of people who will disagree with that interpretation, and many will cite Tolkien as a source for that, for why that is not the case. So certainly his pushback had some effect in that regard. Whether this example applies to or transfers well to the discussion of sci-fi or not, I don't know. That's a discussion for another day, but it's food for thought nonetheless, I think. In the end, I think I'll echo Richard's sentiments on this. No matter what the correct answer is, assuming there is a correct answer, or what the historical reasons are, which, don't get me wrong, as I stated in the interview or before, they are important to recognize and understand, but in the end, it's not worth polarizing the science fiction community over this topic, as sometimes this topic tends to do. I do think it's a minority of cases, but it sometimes does, and I think it's not worth doing that. And with that, I think I'll end the video here. I think I said everything that I wanted to say on the topic. For now, maybe I'll revisit it in the future, who knows. But I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed the discussion, and I hope you enjoyed my thoughts on it. And if you did, hopefully I will see you on the next one.